has failed time and time again.
We are angry.
For students to showcase their talent. OppiTV tonight explores the highly publicized and discussed conflict between Israel and Palestine, particularly focusing on the Gaza Strip. We look at the role of global media in reporting and representing the conflict and the implications that has on our understanding of the issues at the heart of the violence. Recently, South Africans in their thousands took to the streets of both Cape Town and Johannesburg in support of either Israel or the Palestinian territory. As student media, we recognize the importance of having a discussion around the topic, which resonates so profoundly with so many South Africans. We would like to be clear, however, that OppiTV has not taken any position regarding the conflict sides. The crux of this discussion is to understand how we have come to think about the conflict in Gaza and the way that we do, and the contribution of the media to the opinions we have formed. We understand that we are using a media platform to discuss other media, which may imply that we're taking sides. This, however, is part of the difficulty that arises in media coverage, and that's what we want to tackle tonight. We will constantly come back to the question of the role of the journalist in representing the conflict and what that means for our perspectives. Throughout the discussion, we will accept questions and comments from the studio audience made up of Rhodes students and interested parties. We will also be accepting questions from Twitter, so please tweet us your comments and questions using the hashtag OppiDebate. On our panel tonight, public intellectual Professor Stephen Friedman, Palestinian scholar Dr. Irene Calis, media academic Anthony Collins, Oppitan Press politics editor Taryn de Kock, Oppitan Press opinions editor Ben Rule, and Activate politics editor Nick McGregor. Our starting point tonight is the importance of representation and the use of language when covering conflicts. In a recent article about South African media coverage of the Gaza conflict, Professor of Journalism at the University of Johannesburg, Jane Duncan, says, quote, "Journalism should be defined by values rather than by strategic rituals. Otherwise, it risks becoming an unthinking, unreflective practice. If journalists fail to recognize the fundamental rights and wrongs in the situation, they abdicate their democratic responsibilities to society. The journalism of objectivity and balance should not trump the journalism of justice and truth." Now, what is your view in this idea of justice and truth, the journalism of justice and truth, in terms of the Gaza conflict? Stephen, would you like to contribute there?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'd agree with my colleague in the sense that she seems to be implying that what we need is not balanced reporting, but what we need is people taking a moral position. And I think we all have moral positions. But I think my problem with the way in which the conflict is presented is that it's not balanced, it's not accurate. It's basic rules of journalism are being flouted to produce a highly misleading and a highly slanted picture of what is actually happening. And therefore, I don't think what we necessarily need is for journalists to examine their moral values. I think what we need is for journalists to examine their journalistic values and to ask, you know, if you're using selective information, which they are, if you're refusing to give any background, if you're refusing to give the context, then you're just producing bad journalism. And I think what we're seeing on Gaza at the moment is bad journalism.
Respond as well?
I do agree. I agree with you completely, because the idea that okay, it becomes, I suppose, in the context of social media and the time that we live in, it's not just what people follow these days are kind of, I suppose, hard news. It's also when it comes to things like the daily costs or they're websites that use very selective bits of information, and then they'll use it in a very sensationalist way. So they'll make their readers like want to read. And it's like, guess what's happening now in Gaza? So everyone's like, okay, cool, I want to check this out. And how dare they do that? So I suppose, yeah, I do agree with that statement.
What I think the media has possibly to is the conflation of terms and of language and the use of different kinds of comments that are critical of the Israeli state are seen as anti-Semitic. Those that are sympathetic of the Palestinian people are seen as pro-Hamas. Do you agree that these terms are problematic in any way? Irene, would you like to respond?
Yeah, if I could just back up a bit also and address what we were just speaking about. I don't think this is just about individual journalists. This is a systemic. A representation is systemic, and it's part of the business side of media as well. These journalists are part of a structure media conglomerations who rely on particular sources of funding and are also influenced by particular policy and lobbyists. So it's not necessarily about morality. I think that kind of distracts from the structural aspects of representation in mainstream news media. Language is absolutely essential, and this goes hand in hand with my previous comment about the systemic aspects of representing war in general and how we come to learn about war. Language does, as been recently said by Ilan Pape, cover crimes, and how we articulate this, even to use the word conflict itself, gives us the idea that we're talking about two equal parties, that we're talking about two states. So language is essential in representation, absolutely. Yes.
Ben, can I move to you? You wrote an opinions article about this very same topic, about the use of representation and language. Could you give us a little bit of insight about what you thought about that?
Well, I think the focus of that opinions article is primarily to distinguish between Israel, the Israeli government, Hamas, and Palestine. Because it's like you said, there's a conflation of terms very often when we're speaking to each other, and especially when people who are Jewish speak about Israel and support or defend Israel, they're not necessarily defending or supporting the Israeli government. It's often that we're speaking about two different things when you criticize Israel and I defend it. So until we're clear about what we're arguing about, I think we're going to miss each other. I do have a point, though, also about just the way that both the global and the social media have responded to this. An issue I have a lot with the global media, especially the news articles that cover any of the events, is that events, when they happen, seem immediately to get appropriated into existing discussions. I saw a couple of reports that described the 3 Israeli boys as settlers in the headline. And it seems that we automatically bringing a lot of these events into an immediate political discourse. And that's a conversation that's necessary, but it does mean that we're often ignoring the humanity of the people that have died, or the victims, or what's actually happening to the reason we're interested in this.
You speak about events. Taryn, can we speak a little bit about the idea of history? And has the conflict within media coverage been cognizant of the fact that there is a history behind perhaps the tensions that are there? And why aren't we hearing about this history? Why is it that there are 100,000 people dead, but no kind of background as to what happened, or why we are in the place that we are in?
I think it's just because there has been cognizance of history, but it's been one-sided. It's been a very one-sided history. It's often been a history that is not critical of the views it projects, which obviously sounds a bit confusing, because how do you be critical of something that you very clearly believe in? And I also think that history is being used in a very instrumental way. I think that the way in which we are being told to understand the history of the conflict is being told in such a way that it necessitates or condones the actions of Israel in its sort of what we should be considering to be its responses to Palestine and to the offensive by Palestine, I think that one of the problems I've had with sort of researching in this area is that it just grows and grows and grows. The more that you try to research it, the more it just gets bigger and bigger, the more you try to understand what is really going on. But I think the biggest problem is that history is always told from a very, very biased and very politicized perspective, so it's hard to often engage with the facts of what has happened. But the fact of what has happened is generally that this is very much a conflict governed by or dominated by one side of the offensive.
And speaking of history, history isn't obviously isolated. Different countries have different histories, but they often collide and contribute to each other. Anthony, if we could speak about the idea that there's a disproportionate coverage of the Gaza conflict, as opposed to what's happening in Syria, as opposed to the Yazidi refugees in Iraq. How do we kind of consolidate that? Is there a reason for that? Is there a reason that there's such a huge kind of coverage of the Gaza conflict, as opposed to other places that are experiencing almost the same or even more levels of violence?
Yeah, this is an almost universal problem, is that the media, and I don't know what people are talking about when they talk about the media. I can't see a unified thing. that I can imagine is the media. But any kind of violence and conflict coverage isn't in the first instance usually proportional to the events. It's proportional to the way in which sort of pre-existing discourses have already identified certain things as being important and less important. And one of the key factors within that is that usually certain categories of people are projected as being more important and less important. And that certain lives get more airtime than others. And I think that the real reason that if one's just going to make the comparisons with other kind of Middle Eastern situations of violence, that historically Israeli lives are seen as being more valuable than Arab lives, and that's why this particular conflict is given much more media attention. Historically, Israel gets the attention from the Western media in the way that other Middle Eastern countries don't. So it's really an artifact of the disproportionate valuing of Israeli versus Arab life.
Any questions or comments from the audience before we move on? Yes.
I'd like to go back to what Prof. Friedman said earlier on about journalists not having a necessary role in terms of picking a particular moral stance with reports to this particular issue. I do agree that journalistic values have to be reviewed to a certain extent in terms of how journalists do their work, but at the end of the day, it is going to, because it's a selective process, and I think you point that out, pick a particular moral position. So isn't it better to a certain extent to explicitly or intentionally choose a particular moral position instead of have one that will be imposed by particular journalistic values that might even benefit certain powers, if that makes sense?
I think that, look, as I said before, human beings have moral perspectives. I'm not suggesting that journalists should pretend to be machines. What I am saying is that if you have a situation, and I'll give some examples, in which basic tenets of journalism are violated, and yes, I take the point that there's diversity, but there's quite frankly not as much diversity as there should be. Example one, throughout this conflict, Hamas has been offering a 10-year ceasefire, which is conditional simply on the Israelis agreeing to the terms that they negotiated at Oslo a few years ago and haven't implemented. That has not appeared in the media at all. Now, that's just basically bad journalism. What is the problem about reporting that? Okay, Hamas's alleged role in the killing of 3 teenagers is very often taken as a given, despite the fact that no evidence has been produced to support that allegation, despite the fact that Israeli police have said that there is no evidence linking Hamas to that. So those are just 2 examples of cases in which basic journalistic craft says you may have a moral position, but if you do not report basic facts, then it's not a rarefied issue. It's simply a case of saying you've taken sides by suppressing evidence.
Any other questions or comments? Yes, you may.
Question. I think that's also having a moral position and taking that into your journalism is one of the problems with this discourse, because a lot of both sides firmly believe that they have the correct moral position. And no one seems to be evaluating, they seem to just be reporting based on that position, and then we end up talking past each other with 2 completely different dialogues.
Stephen, you spoke about kind of the questions that we're not asking, and that is what we'll be speaking about after this break. Thank you for listening. We'll be back after this.
Interested in OppiTV? Here's how to watch us online. Jump onto the oppidanpress.com in your web browser. Click the OppiTV tab and enjoy our wide range of video content on demand.
Act natural, everybody.
I'm busy doing that.
Watch OppiTV.
Watch OppiTV.
You're watching OppiTV.
Watch OppiTV.
Hallo, ich heiße Marco Schäfer und ich bin auf OppiTV. Hi, my name is Marco Schäfer and I'm on OppiTV.
My name is Sam. Watch OppiTV.
Hi, my name is Titi and I'm on OppiTV.
Hi, I'm Olivier. I come from Mauritius and I'm here in Rhodes University to watch OppiTV.
Come and watch OppiTV.
My name is Olivia.
My name is Tari.
And we're watching OppiTV.
You're watching OppiTV.
We're talking about the things that we're not hearing about the conflict. The Gaza Strip is a resource-rich area. Untapped gas reserves off the coast of Gaza are worth an estimated $4 billion by British Gas. Where's the resource question and all of the reports that we're hearing? Can we go back to Irene?
Sorry, again?
The resource question.
Yes.
What we're not hearing is about the resources that are present in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah.
Where is the resource question and all of the reports that we're hearing?
Well, yeah, it's absent. But I think that's just one moment. The resource question is one moment that's occurring. I don't necessarily think that's one of the main aspects that are not being talked about. It's one moment in a series of moments of different aspects of the situation. There's a protracted and systemic military power that is controlling all the resources, whether it's the sea, the land, the water under the resources in the West Bank. You have one of the largest water aquifers under the West Bank. The airspace, the military space. So it's a conglomeration. The sea resources is one aspect of this.
Taryn, would you like to comment on that as well?
I think I found coverage on Haaretz about how internationalizing Gaza disadvantages Israel, and it talks about the resources. It also talks about just democratizing Gaza on a basic level, as in allowing it an airport, allowing it to use its marine reserves. But I do think that even though it does point to an important element in the conflict, it shouldn't detract from what is generally going on. I mean, a resource question is a very important question, and it's integral to whether Palestine will be able to sustain itself if it should gain some form of independence. But I think we shouldn't allow ourselves to be sidetracked by that kind of discussion and avoiding what is generally going on right now.
And Anthony, you speak about, you teach a course in truth and trauma, and you've said that there's been a great deal of traumatic visuals concentrating on the deaths of children, especially Palestinian children. But on the one hand, some journalists have been accused of relying on figures provided by Hamas, which would therefore serve the interests of the Palestinian cause. But Israeli lobbyists argue that these visuals and statistics demonize Israel and glorify Hamas, that is also involved in violent acts. So firstly, how do we balance this reporting when it comes to statistics? We see a lot of statistics, a lot of death, a lot of kind of very traumatic visuals. How much are we paralyzing almost the viewership into inaction, and how much are we actually showing the extent of the conflict?
It seems there's a whole lot of questions there. I mean, I don't know what it would mean to want to balance this. There's no balance. This is not two matched sides having a war with each other. It's a massive preponderance of force against a very, very weak counterforce. Nearly all of the deaths are on one side. So in that sense, balance certainly wouldn't mean anything like sort of equal time, unless it's equal time per body of each infant or something. The real interesting question is the reaction to the visual images, and particularly the thing that seems to have that affected a lot of people is the images of children who've been killed in the violence. And what's interesting is that this is a kind of a new thing, and it speaks to my previous point of me not knowing what people are talking about when they talk about the media before, because previously there used to be a couple of sort of centralized Western media houses that more or less controlled the flow of information out of Palestine and Israel. And what we're seeing now is that the sort of eruption of social media, the disaggregation of the media, the way in which individuals can now take and transmit photographic evidence. And so there's this eruption of images which previously hadn't defined public debate around what is going on in Palestine, and suddenly they are. Suddenly the sort of global accessibility of these horrifying images is producing a fundamental tilt in global sensibilities, because people are having access to this other information that was previously restricted. And I think in that sense that stream of images is extremely important, traumatic though they are, in shifting the control of the understanding of what is actually taking place on the ground. At the same time, I think there's a lot of the issues around representing complex historical, geopolitical conflict in terms of bodies of children, that it ultimately just reduces it to these sort of increments of human tragedy that may produce outrage or anger or despair, but they don't actually by themselves provide a coherent analytic framework for understanding why the conflict is so intractable, the distributions of power, the histories behind it. So those images are only effective if they also facilitate some kind of analysis. And often very traumatic images don't facilitate any analysis. They produce these kind of emotional responses and then a kind of a shutting down, a sort of a state of shock afterwards. And there's perhaps a danger that as soon as those streams of images die away, when the actual immediate bombings cease, that it won't open up a space of comprehension. Things will just close down into the media just going somewhere else and focusing on something else, and the international awareness and sympathy kind of evaporating.
If I may just
yes,
add to
go
that,
ahead.
I agree. And I think that these images, they may seem to be shifting kind of sensibilities, but I think they're equally problematic, because they're still treating this situation in a spectacular gaze. And what is missing is the everydayness and the routinization of a system of a colonial power and people living under occupation. And there's a bureaucracy in place which is never talked about, which is how this routinization occurs, which routinizes subordination and loss on a daily basis through paperwork, through having to carry the required permits, IDs, and these are the instruments of violence through which Palestinians get dispossessed on a daily basis. And the spectacular gaze does not allow us to understand this, like you're saying, the more fundamental and protracted sense of what we're dealing with.
Just to add on to that, it's also the flood of images on the social media is problematic from another sense, because social media doesn't, and we've had enough problems and mistrust with the global news media not engaging with their sources, but social media does that to a lesser extent. We've seen scandals about pictures of Syrian children being said that they were in Gaza, and there's just anybody can make a meme. I think that's where we're at, and Facebook and Twitter are a lot less engaging and happy to share information. I remember there was a complete scandal on my Facebook in January when Kanye West apparently said that he was the next Mandela. This was a satire article, but everybody sort of saw the headline, shared it, and completely went into an uproar without actually looking at the source or the reason. And I think the sort of spillover of this into the social media makes it very easy for people to pick the information that suits them without actually engaging in what's going on the ground.
Nick, would you agree?
To an extent, I heard of a story. I think it was last year where I think it was Syrian kids, and it was a picture of a child sleeping next to two graves, and it went completely viral. And it was like, look what's happening here! Like this child sleeping next to the graves of his brothers and sisters or something. And then the photographer released another photo a couple of months later, saying, look how easily we can all be duped into thinking that this is actually happening, because it wasn't true at all. So I mean, that's how quickly things can go viral. But then also, to an extent where like if we are hearing that kids are being killed, kind of, and I suppose and that isn't enough, and then maybe the photos are necessary. Like if a furor isn't ensued immediately afterwards, that we do hear about things like that, then maybe photos like that are necessary.
Sorry, can I just
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yes, obviously some people might falsify things and that's very acceptable. Is there seriously a debate about whether children are being killed in Gaza at the moment? Is there a debate about whether children are being killed in Syria at the moment? So yes, that is unacceptable. But, you know, when you talk about things being falsified, you're talking about people fabricating things, inventing things that didn't happen. Whatever some people may or may not be doing, these things are happening, and I think that we need not to lose sight of that. But just to also support what Irene is saying, just to give a concrete example, obviously violence has to be covered, obviously war has to be covered. But just one aspect of the Palestinian situation, which I have never seen covered in any media, somebody may want to correct me if I'm wrong. If you're a Palestinian person living in Gaza or the West Bank, if you want to go into the state of Israel to work, or I had the experience of watching people during Ramadan who wanted to go and pray, you have to queue up for 2.5 hours at least each way at a checkpoint, at the end of which, and this has all been documented, if you're unfortunate, you may come across a 19-year-old soldier who, to humiliate you as you stand there with your biometric, your hand to take a biometric imprint on one side and your passport on the other side, which is not the most dignified pose in the world, a soldier will then take out their cell phone and phone their girlfriend or boyfriend, or in one case, which was documented, somebody will do their nails, etc., in order to humiliate you. And then you get to the other side, and then later the day, you're going to have to do the whole thing over again. Now, surely this is news. Surely this is something that ought to be covered. I've never seen anybody cover this. And if you started to cover events like that, I think you get a much more accurate picture of what is happening, and perhaps something which human beings can empathize with, because I agree that as horrific as it is, if you simply see dead body after dead body, you don't empathize.
The everyday. Are there any questions or comments from the audience at this point? Yes. We can go back to Taryn.
Or do you want to?
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to add on to what you're talking about specifically about the idea of the coverage of the conflict and regarding children. There was an article on a sort of Zionist website about how it's unfair that the world has spent so much time covering the deaths of Palestinian children. And it made the argument that there has been massive psychological and physical damage, or emotional damage, rather, done to Israeli children due to the conflict. But I think that a question that is often missed, and I think it's missed in sort of mainstream news organizations' accounts and social media accounts, is of the sort of psychological, emotional, and physical damage that is being done to children in Palestine, in Gaza at the moment. I mean, there's not really a sense that this whole conflict has been framed around young people. It's been framed around young people being abducted or young people being killed, and it's the pictures of kids that are being used to sort of elicit support on social networks. So I think that the fact that we've not really gotten into a discussion about the real life effect of it is really important and does really need to be addressed.
Any other comments or questions? No comments or questions. After the break, we'll speak about some of the solutions to the conflict reported in the media. Keep tweeting and using the hashtag OppiDebate. We'll be right back after this.
Act natural, everybody. I'm busy doing that.
Watch OppiTV.
Watch OppiTV.
You're watching OppiTV.
Interested in OppiTV? Here's how to watch us online. Jump onto the oppitinpress.com in your web browser. Click the OppiTV tab and enjoy our wide range of video content on demand.
Watch OppiTV.
Hallo, ich heiße Markus Schäfer und ich bin auf OppiTV. Hi, my name is Markus Schäfer and I'm on OppiTV.
My name is Sam. Watch OppiTV.
Hi, my name is TT and I'm on OppiTV.
Hi, I'm Olivier. I come from Mauritius and I'm here in Rhodes University to watch OppiTV.
Come
And watch OppiTV.
My name is Olivia.
My name is Tari.
And we're watching OppiTV.
You're watching OppiTV.
Social life, issues of space, issues of interacting with colleagues, issues of accent, issues of being able to move in and engage. But this overwhelming feeling of being different.
Debate on the Gaza conflict, and right now some breaking news has just come in. A ceasefire has been announced in Gaza. The ceasefire announced 1 hour ago has led to celebration in the streets of Gaza. Palestinian President has said that there will be a complete stop of fighting. Associated Press have stated that Israel has confirmed the ceasefire. That's an interesting addition to the debate. If we can just go back to the idea of solutions then. Okay, so a ceasefire has just been announced, but ceasefires have been announced before. If we can speak about the media and what kind of solutions they may be offering to this conflict and whether we see solutions or whether we don't. Irene, can I come back to you on that one?
Well, part of the solution has to be representation of reality and not the inverse of reality. And that's essential. That goes back to language, even the idea of balance. It's part. I mean, I think what we have to understand is that the news representation, they're not representing violence, they are part of the violence in what they do not say, and which is shaping public imagination. So it has to be a representation of what is actually happening on the ground.
Stephen?
Look, I think if you look at mainstream media's coverage of it, the solution, if there is a solution which they propose, is something called the peace process, which shouldn't really be called the peace process. It should be, well, it's certainly got nothing to do with peace, but it's not really a protest. It's a sort of industry which carries on year after year. It's not a real negotiation process. It is a pretense at a negotiation process. And whenever it looks like it might become a real process, then it's broken off, etc. And that tends to be what happens, because you have the American Secretary of State involved, and you have somebody from the Israeli government, and you have somebody from Fatah, never from Hamas, because they're obviously not allowed to participate. And that becomes a sort of ongoing media spectacle. It reminds me, incidentally, unfortunately some of us are old enough to remember these things. Under apartheid, every now and then, it used to be a standing joke, one of the newspapers would publish a headline which read "New Deal for Urban Blacks," okay? And this went on for years and years. The only New Deal for urban blacks which was never proposed was dignity in the votes and rights, okay? So urban blacks would repeatedly be offered everything except the only thing which would solve the conflict. The only thing which will solve this conflict in the longer term is real negotiation between representatives of the freely elected representatives, the Palestinian people, and the Israeli state about a mutually accepted settlement. And we never read about that in the newspaper. So we're reading about the phony process. We don't realize, we don't even hear about what would be required to really solve the conflict.
And speaking of solutions coming through from the media, Anthony, if I can just direct this to you, vis-a-vis the journalist on the ground, as a journalist standing in Gaza, surrounded by a lot of death and a lot of violence, what kind of trauma, we're seeing trauma obviously for the audience members and the readers, but what kind of trauma is the journalist facing, and does that affect what they're reporting?
Sure. Look, it's not a unique situation of violence, and in any of those sorts of situations, journalists on the ground are exposed to extreme violence, suffering, destructiveness, and that has a serious impact on them, and they react to it in different ways. And the two main reactions are, on the one hand, for people just to withdraw themselves out of that situation and not to cover those kinds of situations of extreme conflict, which is why certain of the major world conflicts are actually invisible in terms of the media. But the other thing is that kind of experience also often radicalizes people. It also gives them, it commits them even more strongly to trying to represent the cause of the people who are the victims of that violence, and that produces a kind of shift as well. That also that starts adding a different voice into the media mix than might otherwise be there. But to jump back to the question that you were asking before that about solving the conflict through media. I mean, I'm worried about that formulation, because it almost seems to assume that what's going on is a misunderstanding, and if we just cleared up the facts of the matter, then everyone would be able to come to an agreement about the best way forward. And so if we all just had the facts on the table, that we'd be able to see the obvious solution to the conflict, as opposed to the idea that there's an irreconcilable underlying material conflict here. I mean, there's two groups of people who both want the same land and believe they have rights to it based on kind of different histories and different rationales. And simply providing more information is not going to change that. I mean, the only thing that could resolve this conflict is disarming Israel. And if the journalists started focusing on the fact that this is the fourth biggest army in the world, that it's under international law an illegal occupation force, and that the West is completely complicit in arming that occupation force, and until the media starts talking about why that's happening, this idea of this sort of like peace talks, or like realizing what's really going on and seeing what the way forward is, I think that this is kind of nonsensical.
Ben, do you agree that the only way forward is to disarm Israel?
I'm not sure about that bit, and I'm also not sure that I'm placed to say what the way forward is. I don't think I know enough, and that's not the debate I want to wade into at this stage. But what I do want to say, just back about the media focus on solution, is that the only reporting on solution that I've seen in the current Gaza storm has just been about ceasefire. And I wrote an article about sort of the issues in Syria in the previous edition of our newspaper, and I have the same issue with Israel-Palestine, is it seems like this conflict has just become part of the world's decor. And we focus on it every now and then when there's something that changes, when there's something that's news, and then we get over it and go back to reporting about whatever else we report about, and then come back when there's another stark change in the conflict. There doesn't seem to be any media engagement with what's actually happening and the roots of this problem in Gaza or Syria or a few of the other surrounding areas. And that focus has been entirely absent from this reporting that I've read.
Taryn, I'd like to hear your thoughts about this.
I tend to agree with Ben in the sense that I don't necessarily feel like I know enough about the situation to prescribe anything. But I also agree with the idea that it's sort of become part of our decor. I think that we need to start thinking beyond just thinking of it as a regional conflict. I mean, we need to think about the fact that Israel is the only non-Muslim state in the Middle East. We need to think about the fact that it is part of a greater resource crisis. Like, there are many different roles that this conflict plays within our world's politics. So it's not really just an issue that we should be looking at when it becomes fashionable or when something new is happening. It's something that, as small as these two states may be, has a massive contribution to make to the way the world is going in the next couple of decades. Or, it's not a very dramatic statement to make. I think that it's probably one of the last outposts of genuine Western power. I think that it's probably one of the most important outposts of Western power in the Middle East. So I think that we probably also need to change the way we think about the conflict and change the way we're willing to engage in discussions about it.
Are there any questions or comments from the audience? Yes, sir. Can I just come round to you?
I'm a little bit confused about the kind of construction of the media that's being discussed up here. It comes across as if we're talking about these individual kind of free actors, whether it be professional journalists or citizen journalists, who are standing in Gaza and reporting, or sitting behind their computers and tweeting and Facebooking about these things. But there hasn't been any mention of the fact that these journalists, these professional journalists, work for major corporations that have vested interest in this conflict. And it's not so much that individual journalists might not be able to report on these things, but we see time and time again that when people do take public stances, they are immediately shut down by powerful interests. We just have to look at Penelope Cruz and Javier Bardem. As soon as they make a statement, 10 minutes later they come back pleading ignorance and balance. And we need to kind of be more cognizant that these aren't kind of independent actors who are reporting on these things, and they are beholden to powerful media corporations, and that needs to be part of the discussion.
Any other comments from the audience? Yes, let me come around to you.
Hi, thank you. I'd just like to pose a general question to whoever would be interested to answer. I'd like to go back to the point that you said about disarming Israel would be part of a solution. But surely, in the interest of all fairness, we should also talk about disarming Hamas, because we've been talking about everything that Israel has done, but I feel like we should talk about more how there are two sides to this party, and how Hamas has been shooting rockets into Israel continuously. And honestly, in all fairness, shouldn't Hamas be spoken about as well? We spoke about peace processes and ceasefires, but Hamas themselves have broken those ceasefires multiple times, only hours into it. Shouldn't we also be talking about disarming Hamas?
Anthony, would you like to respond?
Sure. I mean, I suppose the simple and facetious answer is no, we shouldn't, because Hamas is really not armed in the way that Israel is. And once again, it's this sort of fake construction of these two warring parties, as opposed, whereas in fact what you've got is this one of the biggest armies in the world occupying people who are practically, effectively unarmed. So to talk about disarming both sides is to feed into this kind of nonsensical sort of imagining of equal partners in a war. Certainly, it would be that one of the desirable outcomes is that all parties would walk away from violence as a way of negotiating their interests. But at the moment, there's simply no proportionality in the use of violence as a negotiating tool.
To add to that.
Go ahead, Stephen.
It's part of the distortion of this conflict that this point is constantly raised. The first recorded instance of Hamas offering an unconditional, indefinite end to the conflict was in 1997. Okay, the Israelis simply ignored it. The Israelis have consistently refused to negotiate with Hamas. The Israelis, when Hamas won an election with the Americans, starved it out and used violence in order to overturn the result of an election. Every agreement that has been made which has affected Hamas has been broken by the Israeli side, and that can all be documented, not by flaky sources, by mainstream sources. As far as the rockets are concerned, it is worth bearing in mind that before the Israelis started their current attack on Gaza, 3 rockets had been fired in a space of 18 months. Okay? Since then, thousands of rockets have been fired. The cause of the rockets is Israeli aggression on Gaza. If the Israelis had left Gaza alone, no rockets would have been fired. And I think that is, and there I would agree with Anthony, that is the sense in which this kind of, on the one hand this, and on the other side that, simply distorts the reality of the conflict.
Irene, you wanted to contribute?
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that this situation and Israeli policies towards Palestinians has been going on even before Hamas existed. So Hamas is part of the perpetuation of dehumanizing Palestinians and creating this seeming this way that we can't empathize because somehow they're just monsters and terrorists and characterized in particular ways. If Hamas is the problem, then what's the story about the West Bank? Why is we have the Palestinian Authority supposedly administering the West Bank? So that's not Hamas. So what's the story there? There is also the target changes with the moment, but the consistency is that they're Palestinians. It's whatever form they become, the terrorist, the demographic threat. In more recent years, Israel is targeting human rights activists, high-level human rights activists who are engaging in non-violent. If you're going to take up the discourse of violence and non-violence, non-violent resistance. And so, why are these individuals being targeted? The reason is because the entire population is being criminalized, and any sort of act of resistance becomes a criminal offense.
Would you like to respond to that? Okay, let me come around to you.
Just to your point, what about when Israel, one of the Camp David Accords, I forget which one, and I don't want to get my information wrong, Israel has made a concerted effort to try for peace. What happened when Israel offered, I can't remember which one, all of Gaza, I think around 97% of the West Bank and half of Jerusalem, and that offer was rejected? What about then? And then you talk about disproportionality of rockets, when in the last 140 days, over 800 rockets have been shot, which granted, you talk about that Israel is far more armed, but those rockets are aimed blindly, whether it's at civilians or purely with the hope of them hitting something. I'd like to ask about that.
Okay, look, first of all, on Camp David, this is one of the great myths which has been demolished by Bill Clinton's negotiator, by American sources, etc. What the Palestinians were offered at Camp David was a Bantustan. Okay, they were offered a Middle Eastern equivalent of Transkei, in which the major strategic centers would be Israeli and the periphery would be Palestinian. And the stuff about 97% and 3% is totally misleading, because the 3% was actually where all the economic activity is, etc., which is how apartheid worked here. Any Palestinian leader who had accepted what was offered at Camp David would have been rejected by the Palestinian people immediately, because that leader would have destroyed the future of the Palestinian people and condemned them to live in a Bantustan permanently. As far as the rockets are concerned, the point is, I happen to think that firing rockets is a particularly bad idea, but that's not the point. The point is that if you have an organization representing occupied people, which has been offering a ceasefire now for something like 25 years, which has repeatedly demonstrated, and I think that can be demonstrated as well, can repeatedly demonstrate that when there is a genuine ceasefire, it sticks to it. There was a period in which Hamas committed itself, incidentally, to a one-year ceasefire, which it entirely implemented. That if you have a situation where there will be no rockets if you don't invade Gaza, and there will be rockets if you invade Gaza, then obviously one is looking at a situation where the cause of the rockets are the military invasion. And whether I like rockets or not, to blame the rockets on something which were created by an occupying power seems to me to miss the point of the conflict.
Thank you for your thoughts. We will go to a short break right now, and as we come back, we'll have our closing comments. Thank you.
The social life, issues of space, issues of interacting with colleagues, issues of accent, issues of being able to move in and engage. But this overwhelming feeling of being different.
Interested in OppiTV? Here's how to watch us online. Jump onto the oppidanpress.com in your web browser, click the OppiTV tab, and enjoy our wide range of video content on demand.
Welcome back to the OppiTV debate on Gaza. We have a few tweeted questions here. One from Dapwa: is more access to non-American and non-Western media likely to change public opinion in America? Can I direct that to you, Anthony?
I've no idea. I mean, I can't speak. I find the United States fundamentally bewildering. I mean, the fact that their primary source of news is Fox News is incomprehensible to me. No part of my intellectual apparatus can help me understand what is really going on in that country. So this is just an enigma to me. It just seems madness. Nevertheless, in a kind of a global sense, I think the shifts in the media will mean that internationally, and we've already seen it now, I think, internationally there's been a real deepening of sympathy towards Palestine on the basis of the Western centers of media losing their grip on the flows of information, and particularly this kind of discursive terrorism that has for a long time controlled the media, in the sense of anyone who critiques the aggression of the State of Israel being accused of being anti-Semitic. I think that kind of rhetorical thuggery has started falling apart and is being replaced by something which is almost like its opposite, which is a sort of construction of the narrative of that what is happening in Palestine is in fact a genocide, precisely in the way that the Holocaust was an attempted genocide.
Irene, do you have any comments on that?
I'm sorry, can you just remind me of the question?
Is more access to non-American and non-Western media likely to change public opinion in America?
Probably not. I think there's a strong lobby force that works at the political level and seeps its way down. But yeah, I have no idea. I think this is not just about public opinion. I think representation is part of it, but this is also a big business. I disagree that this has just become kind of daily fare, the kind of comments that were made. We have to ask why that is the case. Why is it the case that the conflict is constantly a focus? It's a business. It's a huge business. And a lot of people, unfortunately, have a stake in keeping this situation going.
And can we just take a few comments and questions from the audience? I know Mr. had a question here.
On terrorism, we live now in a world where they have launched a war on terror. So how does that sort of shape the response, or the way we think about politics in general, international politics in general, and the conflicts in Gaza? For instance, in history in South Africa, Mandela for years and others were called terrorists. How do we start to debunk that? How do we start to sort of, think about politics not within that trajectory?
Can I direct that to Ben?
Ideally, that's a question I'd give a weekend of thought to, because that's a really good question. But off the top, I think the situation in Israel and Palestine has suffered from a Western spillover against, which probably was even pre-9/11. But there's definitely something familiar about Hamas that's been portrayed by the media, that they share some elements with Al-Qaeda, or that seems to be how the perception is coming across in the States. And that's a problem, because they're coming from a fundamentally different place in history, and I think we do need to get out of the sort of mentality that that entire region is just all the politics there and all of the non-governmental resistance movement politics are terrorism. I think it's very easy to slip into that rhetoric.
Are there a few more questions and comments here? Let me come to you, sir.
Okay, thank you. I think in terms of trying to find a solution, and we've been talking about the media, and it was mentioned that the media isn't going to bring about a solution. And I think my view is, if we do want to make this analogy between apartheid and the occupation in Israel and Palestine, then there are certainly those links, and there was internal pressure to bring apartheid to an end, and external pressure as well, and that is a similar thing that we need to try and recreate international popular pressure around this issue of Israel and Palestine, and that is being systematically silenced by the media. The media is contributing, and I think a large part of that is this conflation, or this idea of seeing Arab, Muslim, Palestinian, terrorist all as synonymous concepts. So the media's role is in trying to create a situation where we do not see Arab, Muslim, terrorist, Palestinian as all the same thing, but where we try and see that humanity, and that's where the media comes in. But in terms of an actual solution, the popular support or lack thereof of the international, of people in the world, that is where we need to look towards, where we need to look for a solution to this issue. That's my view, at least.
Okay, we'll take one more comment or question from the floor. Let me come to you, ma'am.
In response to kind of what he said and what Irene was touching on about the media trying to bring in the normality and the day-to-day issues of access to water and proper housing, I do think that there is a lot of alternative media sites that are coming through like electronic intifada, where you're starting to read about people's stories. And I do think that that is coming a lot more through social media and alternative media. And whilst mainstream media still has a long way to go in terms of reporting the reality on the ground, I do find that there is hope in terms of these alternative sites literally giving journal updates of people's lives, and people just saying, I had a lot of issues trying to get my children to a school today. And I find that has been really important in terms of not normalizing, but bringing the normal everyday struggles to everyone else, and realizing that it's about those aspects that you can actually sympathize with, because that's what you deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Can I ask that any last closing comments come through from the panelists? Yes.
Well, just to respond to both of you, because I think there's some issues. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that is how how progress will be made, is that decent people around the world will begin to see that this is unacceptable and will support various forms of pressure, whether it's simply not buying various goods or whatever the case may be. But I must say that I'm extremely pessimistic about the prospect that mainstream media will change their message on this issue. And not primarily, yes, those issues which were raised from the floor about the various interests involved are relevant, of course. But there's one elephant in the room which we haven't discussed on this, which I think is a major source of problem on this issue, and very important for people who are concerned about journalism. And that, quite frankly, is the role of pure and simple bullying in this issue. If you speak to journalists in the UK, if you speak to journalists in places like Australia, etc., they will tell you that news organizations there are terrified of producing a balanced picture on Palestine, because whenever they do that, they are subject to incredible pressure from the Israeli lobby, which makes it very difficult to do that. I mean, in South Africa, just one example, because we're running out of time, SABC, who really should know better, hosts a debate between the Israeli ambassador and Ilan Pappé. The Israeli ambassador announces that he will not debate Professor Pappé because he doesn't debate Israeli citizens. Why not, he didn't explain. At which stage SABC agree to allow the ambassador to evade a debate with Professor Pappé. That's not sensible journalism, but it's a result of this bullying. And there we are extremely fortunate that, as Anthony said, as you said, it's not only social media, it's the fact that as a result of electronic media, as a result of the internet, there are new voices which are not subject to that bullying. And I think that those new voices are going to play an increasing role in this, in advancing the Palestinian cause.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. The discussion we've had tonight has been undoubtedly interesting and thought-provoking, and we hope that it'll continue outside of this space. I'd like to thank our panelists for guiding the discussion, the audience members for their participation, and everyone for tweeting in their comments. Let's hope that we can truly celebrate the ceasefire that has been announced while this broadcast took place along with Gaza. Thank you for watching, and have a good night.